Coming up next on Headline Humboldt, longtime spokesperson for Humboldt County's fishing community, Ken Bates, discusses the recent listing of wind farm leases off the Northern California coast. Also, KEET contributor Ryan Hutson brings us an update on the case of Kyle Zoellner, who won a jury judgment against an ex-Arcata cop for more than $750,000, only to have a judge determine the officer actually had probable cause to arrest him. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. Top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. The federal government recently put 5 wind farm lease areas up for auction off the northern and central California coasts, 2 of which are located just west of Humboldt County. Supporters, including North Coast Congressman Jared Huffman, speak in glowing terms about the project and claim that it will help address the climate crisis while also helping to revitalize Humboldt County's economy by transforming the Port of Humboldt Bay into a windmill manufactory. According to the final sale notice, there are 43 companies that are qualified to bid for these leases during the December 6th auction. Some, while mostly supportive, are insisting that the project be handled in a fair and equitable manner. For instance, the North Coast Community Benefits Network issued the following statement today. Quote, past boom and bust industries in the North Coast have harmed tribal nations and precious ecosystems, and the region is still recovering from a legacy of underinvestment. Today, many communities in the region lack reliable electricity, broadband, transportation, and housing, as well as access to childcare and other services, pivotal services that are needed to host this new industry. I spoke with Congressman Huffman Thursday, and he had this to say about the project.
We talk a lot about this climate crisis. We talk about a rapid transition to a decarbonized economy. You can't get there without projects like this. And so we have to find ways to make this work, to say yes to clean energy projects. And Humboldt County is very fortunate to have this remarkable wind resource several miles offshore. I think it can also be a great job story for the region. As you may remember, in the Inflation Reduction Act, Joe Manchin stuck in these kind of hostage provisions where if you want to do any renewables on public land or off our coast, you've got to offer these very large fossil fuel leases as well. By getting it in before the end of this calendar year, these leases are not tethered to that kind of Faustian Manchin deal. Okay, so that's one thing. But they also gave a credit for community benefits and included some very specific provisions about a process to confer with fishermen and address their concerns.
While there seem to be obvious benefits, it's unclear at the moment how much power these mills will ultimately provide and how far it will go toward offsetting the county's own power usage. Concerns have also been raised about the impact of this and other projects on local fisheries. Joining us now to talk about that is Ken Bates, a longtime local resident and a member of the Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association, both as a past president and as past vice president, and now he is the current president of the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association, which deals exclusively with wind power issues. So obviously, you heard Congressman Huffman's statements, and you've been involved in this for a while. What's your response?
Well, first of all, James, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present kind of the fisherman's perspective. And I need to start right away to explain that fishermen are not opposed to renewable energy.
Yeah.
Fishermen are right now, they're some of the direct recipients of the climate change stuff that we're seeing. You know, we're seeing things change in the ocean radically over the last 10 years. So, you know, we get it. Fishermen get that. You know, I think that the biggest concern for fishermen has been the way that these projects have been proposed, you know, in the permitting processes and some of those things like that. Congressman Huffman is right. The statements that he made about, you know, we're not going to get off of fossil fuels unless we go ahead and do big projects are completely correct. Most fishermen that you'll talk to think that the ocean is a pretty hostile environment, and that probably this is one of the worst places to put these projects. That being said, again, California fishermen, while nobody is very supportive of the wind power projects in the ocean, you know, we're 5 or 6 years down the road, you know, in this process. And for fishermen, one of the things that collectively the fishermen's associations in California are hoping for is if these projects do go forward, you know, and eventually after the lease sale goes into effect, that they will temporarily put the brakes on expanding these until we actually see if they're able to hold these units in the ocean through the storms, and see if they are able to produce power at the rates that they're forecasted to do, and for fishermen to see if fishermen can survive these projects.
Yeah. Now, when you mentioned the most fishermen view it as a hostile environment, I mean, obviously it's dangerous. There's bad weather. The coast off of here is stormy often, and lots of wind and surf and whatnot. I mean, are you concerned that they won't even be able to last as long as they're forecasted? Or I mean, what's your actual...
Well, yeah, I mean, we are concerned about that. So a couple examples. Recently, the Northwest National Laboratories got federal permits to put what they call a LIDAR buoy out in the proposed wind and energy area. It was going to be there for a year. It was there for almost 2 years, but it wasn't there continuously because it was repeatedly damaged to the point where it didn't function in storms. And at one point, it actually, one weather event ripped the generator off of it and stuff. So the other thing is that, you know, fishermen expect that these big turbines will be essentially drug off station. You know, they'll be parted from their moorings. They may part their communication and electrical cables. And you know, if you go online and look at some of the problems that big machines have, turbines are one of the things that we're learning how to design better and run better. But you'll see, you know, turbine events, failure events where they explosively basically come apart, you know, for overspeeding. They've been responsible for oil spills when the seals go on them. You know, there's been numerous...
The seals, like the gaskets or...
Yes, yeah, the seal, yeah, exactly.
Not seals like...
Yeah, no, it's lubricating oil, lubricating oil seals. You know, losing blades, all those things. And so when you see those kind of problems on a terrestrial site, while they're dangerous and they're problematic and nobody wants to see that happen, they are contained. When things like this happen in the ocean, you know, human beings are not able to clean up the debris from these things. We still really haven't been able to clean up an oil spill, you know, as much as we've tried to do. So fishermen have concerns about that. You know, the loss of fishing grounds is at the top of the list. You know, you'll hear fishermen say, well, we're trading a sustainable seafood resource that we've managed, you know, for years and years and years in California for power.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, that's one interesting point, because if they're in a fixed location as a windmill out in the ocean, I mean, normally the fleet can move around according to where the fish are, right? But if there is a locked location where there are a bunch of these windmills, that will permanently be off.
Yeah, those will be off limits. The Coast Guard on the East Coast has made it very clear, you know, and then other fisheries groups that are working with the East Coast projects, you know, have looked at this stuff. And for the most part, you know, the trawl and longline groundfish fisheries, you know, are completely incompatible with these projects.
Can you explain the physics about why?
Yeah, I can explain why, sure. So let's just take the Humboldt, California WIA, the wind energy area that was proposed. First, I think it's important to note that that wind energy area was picked by Bureau of Ocean Energy Management without any input from the fishing industry. They looked at what was the windiest area that was the closest to Eureka to plug into the grid, and that's what they did. So when you go ahead and let's just talk about anchored wind turbines. You know, they're talking about anchoring these things in 400, 500 fathoms of water. So they have to have tremendous anchors with lots of scope. The scope is the distance between the anchor and the actual turbine, you know, that's floating on the surface. Yeah. They have to be able to hold these things through extreme weather events. You know, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, satellite data showed that they recorded a 90-foot wave off of Humboldt County offshore during a storm deal. And that's a combination of waves hitting at the same spot at the same time, but that's still a pretty big pile of water. Yeah. So when all this stuff is anchored, you know, you can't pull a net or a trawl through there. Certainly longline gear, while it's small, it's a longline gear is smaller than quarter of an inch, the ground line for longline gear, but it's no match for any of the systems that they have for holding those in place. There's interconnecting cables that go from one turbine to another, and then right now they're also talking about having sort of substations that are floating, where the cable comes into the beach. For this wind energy area here, if they decide to bring a cable straight to Humboldt Bay, that will take up an additional 20 square miles. So we're looking at, and that's through the crab grounds. So we're looking at basically around 220 miles of lease area and a buffer around that, because the way that fishing works is that you can't get close to this stuff. The currents change direction depending on water depth. You can have a surface current going one direction. You can start to set long line gear. It goes a different direction. You find out you're in a different place. And so these areas are going to be, the boundary around these that fishermen will need to avoid will be much greater than just the lease area.
Yeah. If the fishermen had some input in where they were located, would you have advised something different?
I think that let's just take the Humboldt Weah for a second. So that is basically essentially west of Mad River, offshore. And that's just outside an area that the longline and trawl fishermen refer to as the rock pile. And that's been a traditional fishing area, gosh, I want to say since 1920.
So it's a sweet spot.
It's the sweet spot. And the thing about that spot is that you can get out there to work. It's an area that fish tend to congregate. And when the weather generally gets bad, which is usually out of the northwest, you have a downwind ride home. I'm sure that if fishermen were asked to go ahead and pick a spot, they would never have picked that spot. Yeah. They would probably have suggested another very windy area, which is just south of Eel River Canyon off Cape Mendocino, which is an area that, while there's still fishing that takes place there, I want to say presently it's less critical there. Yeah.
What's interesting is that, or not interesting, but what's important to point out, I think, is that it's not as if this is going to be an effect on an industry that's otherwise booming and has everything going for it. This is another challenge in an already really challenging environment for fishermen, right?
Yeah, and so
people.
You've actually caught it, and that's the deal. Let's just talk just a little bit about that. So, if you were to take a felt pen, a marker, and you had a map of the ocean off of California, and you went ahead and you colored in every area where there was a restriction, a cable lane, a marine protected area, national marine sanctuary, closures for habitat and essential fish habitat and those things like that, dumping grounds that where the Navy's abandoned stuff for years and years and years, almost all of California would be black. There is a restriction almost anywhere. So California, while in a positive note, has the most regulated fisheries in certainly continental United States and maybe in the world. We also have the least amount of access to fishing grounds and to alternate fishing grounds. So every time a piece goes away, one of the things that happens is that, maybe a couple boats go to Oregon, they go to Newport. Or maybe they go to Washington, and those kind of things. So no big deal, we just lost a couple boats. Well, eventually, you start to lose enough fishing capacity, and consistent landings that a fish company closes. The people that worked at the fish company lost their jobs, the truckers are gone, pretty soon, you just watch the infrastructure disappear. We used to have 3 fuel docks in 1970. There was 9 fish buyers here and 6 processing plants. We're down to 1 fuel dock, 1 processing plant, and 3 buyers. Yeah. Fort Bragg no longer has a fuel dock. They're barely hanging on, having ice and things like that. Yeah. So the good things and the bad things. Looking at this project over time, I am sure that this project is going to create significant employment for people in Humboldt County, and certainly that is not a bad thing. I think that it's important to point out that Jared Huffman's great efforts to make sure that workers were protected here, went quite a distance. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management lease agreement provides for 20% for workforce investment.
Yeah.
That's a very positive thing.
Absolutely.
Fishermen's experience with these projects, even the cable that's recently been installed here that's still not complete.
The broadband cable?
Yeah, those are all the crews on those boats and most of the workers on the boats, they're all foreign nationals. There's no U.S. personnel on those jobs. So that's good. I think it's also interesting that, Congressman Huffman has actually spent quite a bit of time not only talking to fishermen, but having his staff research the possible negative impacts to the West Coast fishing fleet, not just here in Eureka, because boats come from all over to use this area. And much to his credit, he had basically advocated for an additional 20% bid credit that would be partially used to offset, impacts to the fishing fleet. It's interesting to note that Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, what we refer to as BOEM, they're on their own mission. Their job, they've made it very clear in some of their public statements and some of their documents that their job is to find areas to lease and to lease them, but not necessarily, their job is not necessarily to form regulations and protocols on how these operations might work.
Well, then who's going to do that?
Well, that's the thing. And the crazy thing is that our new association, the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association, just sent in a public comment, it's been about a month ago or a month and a half ago, to BOEM considering a 13-page document that they produced. And that document was essentially, it was called, let me think about this for a second. It had to do with mitigation of impacts to commercial and recreational fisheries, in the outer continental shelf. And that was roughly the title. Now, the thing that was really significant about this document was not the title. The title, they did admit there's going to be impacts in the title. But the next thing that was underneath there was a disclaimer that said that these recommended guidelines had no force or effect of law and did not bind the public, and in this case developers, in any way. So the second thing they say is that we've put together some possible guidelines, but they're voluntary.
Yeah.
And
CYA.
Yeah. And so for California Fishermen's Associations, this is highly problematic. We know now that Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the federal government is not going to put up, strenuous protocols on how these operations are going to take place over time, be it the site survey, or the construction and operations plan, or even decommissioning. So where does that leave the fishing fleet? The kind of the Obi-Wan Kenobi thing here, our only hope now is that state agencies, will take up that charge. Our associations have been actively involved for about 5 to 7 years, 5 years up here, 7 years in Central California, with the State Lands Commission, the California Energy Commission, the Coastal Commission, and California Fish and Wildlife. And for us up here, also Ocean Protection Council. Again, and constantly requesting and challenging these agencies to actually start to work to formulate some sort of rules that we're all going to understand. And it's highly problematic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got about 2 minutes left. One of the things that I really wanted to ask you about is, do you feel like fishermen were included enough in the process up to this point, or is there some amendment in the process that they could use going forward as they consider future leases?
Yeah, so I can answer that question. So since these, with the exception of our interactions and the good rapport that we have with Redwood Coast Energy Authority and Matthew Marshall, otherwise with the state and federal agencies, fishermen have not been at the table partially because we're, a bunch of different associations. In the latest document that came from the Coastal Commission, which is the federal consistency determination for the California lease areas, they have a recommendation that a working group be formed with fishermen. We've been asking now for months that that be formed. It hasn't happened.
Wow.
So yeah, it's problematic, and we're doing our best to make sure that we all have the fishermen have a united uniform message.
Yeah.
But this has been a very fraught, difficult project. It's probably, of all the things that I have tackled since I've had the ability and the privilege to fish, this has probably been at times the most depressing, because we really have not been able to get to, other than Congressman Huffman, other to the folks that are where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
But you know what? Our job, just like this today, is to keep trying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have 90 seconds left, but it seems like there's this complexity here, and the fishermen are admitting that there is an issue with climate change and that we need to figure out ways to generate the electricity, but maybe this isn't the right approach, or it needs to be thought through in a different way. Is that a fair way to say?
So I guess what I would say, because we don't want the not in my backyard thing. But because that's just that's the deal. So what I would say is that fishermen and California Fishermen's Associations understand that these projects are going to come. Oregon, they still don't think that this is ever going to happen. We have a different attitude towards that. We can see that there's going to be a lease sale. We can see the dotted lines on the maps. We know that there's 43 bidders coming up in December. And so again, our goal right now is to say, okay, how can we avoid impacts, minimize for impacts, and then the last thing is to mitigate. And so if we can take care of those, hopefully we'll survive this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ken.
It's always a pleasure. Yeah, I appreciate being able to come here. Thank you.
Yeah. Good looking on the project in the future.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Sunday on PBS, Miss Scarlet and the Duke on Masterpiece.
An item of considerable value was stolen.
Followed by Magpie Murders.
If someone really did push him off that tower, well, there'd have been plenty of volunteers.
And finally, Annika.
We've got the crime scene, it's just in a billion pieces.
First, Miss Scarlet and the Duke, followed by Magpie Murders, and finally Annika, all on Masterpiece.
Sunday evening at 8 on KEET HD.
Stream the best of PBS on any device with the PBS Video app. All your favorite drama, history, science, news, and documentaries, all in one place. Watch your PBS station live or catch up on the shows you missed. Discover new favorites from PBS and locally produced shows from your station. Get the PBS Video app now and stream the best of PBS anytime, anywhere.
The ongoing saga that is the investigation into the death of David Josiah Lawson continues this week after a judge threw out a judgment that would have seen an early suspect in the case win hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kyle Zoellner sued former Arcata detective Eric Losi for vindictive prosecution, and the jury in that case ultimately awarded him more than $775,000 in total damages. The judgment, though, was dependent on the judge finding that there was no probable cause to arrest Zoellner in the first place. This week, the judge found that indeed there was probable cause. Now it appears Zoellner will receive nothing. Ryan Hutson has the story.
This week, a San Francisco judge overturned a civil jury's nearly $800,000 award to Kyle Zoellner in his lawsuit against a former Arcata police officer, alleging that he was a victim of malicious prosecution in regard to his 2017 arrest for the stabbing death of HSU student David Josiah Lawson in Arcata. The trial for Zoellner's civil lawsuit ended with the judge ruling in favor of the defendant, writing, "The court concludes that Mr. Zoellner has not proved the lack of probable cause element of his malicious prosecution claim." Observing the trial proceedings was Charmaine Lawson, mother of Josiah Lawson, whose death Zoellner was charged with originally, but then released from custody when a local judge determined there was not enough evidence to hold him for the crime. Awaiting the trial outcome, Charmaine Lawson explained the situation from inside the courthouse.
So, again, I am about to come face to face with the individual that was arrested and accused of murdering my son, David Josiah Lawson. My son was a Humboldt State University student studying criminology when his life was viciously taken. And the DNA on the evidence is of Kyle Christopher Zoellner. However, Kyle Christopher Zoellner is suing the city of Arcata for wrongful arrest.
Following the jury's verdict awarding Kyle Zoellner over $750,000, the bulk of which would have been paid by the city of Arcata, Charmaine Lawson remained focused on the probable cause element, feeling that the jury was sending a message to law enforcement to do better.
The jurors were sending a message to police officers, but this was the wrong case to send the message when the suspect was obviously the right person that was arrested.
Just a few days later, finding that there was probable cause for the arrest of Zoellner in Lawson's death in 2017, the judge ruled for the defendant, former Arcata police officer Eric Losey. Even though Kyle Zoellner had convinced the jury that elements of malicious prosecution had occurred and was awarded nearly $800,000 by the jury's verdict, Judge Corley denied Zoellner the win and in so doing canceled the monetary award issued by the jury. In regard to the probable cause for Zoellner's arrest for Lawson's stabbing, Judge Corley wrote, quote, "A reasonable officer could believe there was fair probability Mr. Zoellner stabbed Mr. Lawson," unquote. Speaking to Charmaine Lawson by phone, she reacted to the judge's order expressing relief that the San Francisco judge seemed to see what she sees in the evidence related to her son's tragic death in Arcata.
Right now, I am overjoyed and absolutely relieved because the judge got it right. There were absolute probable cause to arrest Kyle Zoellner for the murder of my son. His bloody clothes, the knife found close to the scene.
Now, Zoellner has about 60 days to appeal the judge's ruling in favor of Arcata police officer Eric Losey, as other components of Zoellner's complaints against the city of Arcata and its various staff are still being sorted out. The trial as to malicious prosecution has concluded in favor of the defendant, Eric Losey, despite the jury's findings in favor of Zoellner.
I'm never going to give up until justice is served for my son. I'm not going away. I know that Kyle Christopher Zoellner, based on the evidence, is responsible for the murder of my son. And I will never give up until his murderer is brought to justice. I'm not going away. I thank the judge for seeing the facts very clearly. Again, the evidence was overwhelming, to say the least. It was enough. You don't need an eyewitness with evidence that was presented. DNA, bloody clothes, and a motive. Why do you need an eyewitness? So that would be my question to Maggie Fleming.
The Arcata Police Department is still asking witnesses to come forward. For Headline Humboldt, this is Ryan Hutson.
That's it for this evening. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Stay tuned, stay informed.